This session is called the Organist Palette, an orchestra at your fingertips. When I did a presentation like this a few years ago, I thought, well, I'm going to just start writing down everything that I've learned about registration over the years. And it turned into a 9-page document. There's no way that we'll get through all of this. So we'll move really quickly and have a few general ideas. I want to have some time for questions. And what I'd like you to be thinking as we talk about this is the challenges of your particular instrument or the opportunities maybe to turn that on its end, and how you can get every single possible color and sound out of your instrument. Maybe some things that we discussed here today will give you some ideas that you hadn't already thought of about how to use your instrument and get some different colors. So we'll start right in, and then at the very end I'll play just a little bit so you get a little time to just bask in glorious sound rather than hearing just individual sounds. But let's start out with the basic review of organ tone. There are two types of pipes that create sound in two different ways, but when it boils down to it, we either have flue pipes or reed pipes. Flue pipes are the ones that you see in the facade vertically here, ones where it's sitting on top of the wind chest, the air blows up through it and out the bottom part of the mouth of the pipe, and the air is angled in such a way that it cuts across that top lip of the pipe, part of the air going up into the resonator and part of it blowing out across the front side of the pipe, and that's what actually creates the sound. Just as a flutist playing blows across the metal hole in the flute, it sets the air in that resonator into vibration. It causes that air to start vibrating, and based on whether that pipe is metal or wood, whether the walls of the pipe are thick or not, whether and how wide the pipe is around, what its diameter is, and what its length is, then will determine the pitch and the sound of the tone. Reed pipes are the other kind. The ones, of course, that you see mounted horizontally here are reeds, the chamods. There's an actual a piece of metal inside, a metal reed that vibrates inside that creates the pitch. So just like an oboe, a clarinet, a bassoon, where there's actually a physical reed vibrating, that creates the pitch, and then the length of the resonator kind of enhances the tone of that. If you heard a reed vibrating just by itself without the resonator, it would just sound very nasal, just like kind of like this kind of sound. Very, very nasal, small, thin sound, but then the resonator gives it a particular kind of tone. So those are the two basics. So with flutes, then of course we have three different subsets: principals, flutes, and strings. And I've listed here some of the various names that you'll find. And then within each of those families, you have some flutes that are very broad, some flutes that are kind of small and nasal, some that are harmonic, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. Within the family of reeds, there really are two types. There are conical reeds and cylindrical. Conical, like an ice cream cone. They're shaped like this with a flare at the top. Trumpets, clarions, bassoons, those are all conical reeds. The ones that we think of as chorus reeds. Those are all conical, where there's a gentle flare from the base of the pipe to the top of the pipe. Cylindrical reeds are, like a cylinder, like a paper towel roll. And those have a more nasal tone. Ones like a crumhorn is a cylindrical reed. This dulcian and the voix humaine. The reason that I mention those is cylindrical reeds have very prominent even-numbered overtones. You know, if we in every sound on the organ, there are various overtones present. We hear the fundamental, we hear the low note. But then there are other pitches above that. The easiest one in which to hear that is a quintadina, because it has a very prominent, do you hear that pitch? So we hear them, but we also hear. Well, really, that 2 2/3 pitch that we hear in there is present in every one of these sounds. It's just that we don't hear it really prominently. So when I play this crumhorn, can you hear that pitch in that note? And there's a tiny bit of this one. So you can hear there's an overtone makeup in each of those pitches. Sorry, I'm not showing you my best side. So the reason I bring that up is that cylindrical reeds and conical reeds behave in two different ways, and they tend to work in different ways. I tend to use them separately. When I'm pulling on reeds, if I want power, I tend to use the conical reeds, trumpets, clarions, bassoons. If I want a kind of special effect, if I want that Baroque sound, if I want something that sounds antique-y, then I might use the cylindrical reeds. That gives a different kind of sound then. So this is cylindrical, this is conical. So just thinking about that as you put together sounds can differentiate some of the different colors that we have. This that I put here in italics, it's interesting sometimes to just take a rank, to pull on a stop and listen very closely to the harmonics of a particular note, and hear more than just the fundamental. Hear how rich that sound is that we hear. You can hear various pitches in there. So I sometimes will like to take one of those, a string like a gamba is going to have all of those pitches in there. It has this. So you know how on the organ we have all of these mutations. We have 8, 4, 2 2/3, 2, 1 3/5, 1 1 3rd, 1. Those are all the pitches in the harmonic series. So the reason we have those is because it makes a really nice composite sound when we put those together. Well, really, every note has some of those overtones in it, and to develop your ear, it's valuable to spend a little time playing through notes, and playing in the bottom of the range. You have the best chance of hearing all of those because it's within our aural range. The pitch name on the note, you know, if it says 8 foot, 4 foot, 2 foot, that indicates the speaking length of the lowest note on the keyboard. So if we pull out an 8-foot gamba and we play this, that pipe is 8 feet in length. And we'll get into a little bit more about when that's not the case, as in a stock flute. If you pull out an 8-foot cadet, that pipe is actually 4 feet long because it has a stopper in it, which effectively doubles the speaking length of the pipe. Scaling. Differences in scale among families of organ tone. Flutes are the broadest in scale because they have, it's by scale, I mean the ratio of how big around it to the length of the pipe. So a flute is going to be big in scale. So a principal is going to be somewhat narrower in scale, kind of in the middle. And then a string is going to be the narrowest of those. It's going to be the skinny pipes, the pencil pipes in an organ. The reason I bring this up is because oftentimes it can be very effective to combine stops of the same kind of sound because they have the same scale. So there's a time to combine all strings together, so you have all of these sizzling narrow scale pipes, and not have flutes with it, because flutes are the big broad scales, so they're kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. It's certainly fine to combine them together for a different kind of sound, but try sometimes combining strings and maybe a principal, so that you're staying on this narrower scale end of the spectrum of scale organ pipes. So I kind of match a vowel sound to all of these. Flutes I think of as ooh. Strings I think of as E, because it's a very narrow passage through which the sound is going. And then principals are in the middle, which is appropriate because they're the backbone of the organ sound. So they're kind of like, ah. They combine that chiaroscuro, the brightness and the darkness of both strings and flutes. There are differences in scale according to the time in which your organ was built. And we see this pendulum swing throughout history in organ building. In the early part of the 20th century, when Steer and Hutchings and E.M. Skinner were active building, there was, in general, a leaning towards larger scale pipes for the principal chorus and certainly for the flutes. Strings actually tended to be very, very narrow, so there was this kind of great divide. So you got sizzling strings that sounded almost like frying bacon, is really keen and very much like strings in an orchestra. Whereas the principals tended to be very big and broad, not thin at all, but huge, full body. Then, as we move kind of into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the American Classical School of Organ Building with G. Donald Harrison and Walter Holtkamp, there was a move towards a cleaner chorus sound. And the idea was that by making scales thinner, that it would clean up the sound. You wouldn't have this tubby sound, which is what the reaction was against E.M. Skinner and some of those larger scale ideas of organ building. So when you play a Cassavant or a Holtkamp or an Aeolian Skinner from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you're not going to find big, huge, fat, tubby flutes and principals. In most cases, you're going to find, in general, principals that are narrower in scale, flutes that are narrower in scale, and strings that are actually broader in scale than what was done in the early 20th century. So there was a little bit of, I don't want to use the word homogenization because that sounds really negative, but there was a lessening of extremes, so that on a lot of those instruments, combining flutes and strings and principals all together makes a different kind of effect because they're all similar in scale. The reason also that I bring that up is that then affects the way that you approach those instruments. So if I'm going to play on a big 1920s E.M. Skinner, knowing that when I pull out the second diapason or the first diapason on the grate, that's going to have so much body, I might not need to pull on the chimney flute and the harmonic flute and all of these other 8-foot stops to build a big base of sound for my ensemble. However, if I go to a 1950s G. Donald Harrison Aeolian Skinner or Whiteford Aeolian Skinner, I might want to pull on every 8-foot flute, except for the Celeste, to broaden out that low range, that mid-range of sound. So it's going to affect the way that you approach the instrument. Mutations, lots of different pitches. as one of my colleagues calls them, fractions. He says he doesn't like fractions. He never uses fractions. But fractions can give lots of different color, there again, by enhancing and strengthening the natural pitches that are already present in the harmonic series. I love mutations in the sense that it's kind of like a game of permutations and combinations, if you remember from your calculus days, that there are so many different ways that you can combine them. I think it's important to listen for, is it a flute scale or a principal scale mutation? Flute scale is going to be a bit bigger. You can hear that sounds fluty, as opposed to this one, which is a little more principal scale. It's more like a string sound. The reason that I bring that up is that if you stay with all sounds of the same family of tone, then you will get a sound that really gels together very nicely. These are all flutes because I listen to that 1 1/3 and I can hear that that's a very fluty sound. I think all of these are generally flute scale, as is the sesquialtero on the swell. So when I go to the swell and I say I want to build a sound, that's 8, 2 2/3 and 1 3/5, I am probably not wanting to pull out the gamba and octave 4 and then put the sesquialtero with it. Although that sound works, it's the flutes that make up that family of tone. Those are all flute scale mutations. Principal scale mutations, if you have those on your instrument, like if you have a 2 2/3 quint on your grate, a lot of times that's going to be principal scale. So that means that is going to belong really well with something like 8/4 2 principals, that's going to work in that mix better than if I pull out an 8-foot flute, a 4-foot flute, and a 2 2/3. That sound certainly works, but you want to be judicious and ask yourself, and have the knowledge of, is that a flute scale, is that a principal scale? Is that going to work in a chorus, or is that going to work better as a kind of solo sound? Principal scale tends to work better in a chorus. Flute scale tends to work better if you're doing something kind of sparkly, or wanting to have just a nice solo cornet or something like that. Let's see. Mixtures are part of the principal family, part of the diapason family. At different times in history, principals have tended to be more stringy, more string scale. And then, as was the case in the early 20th century, once we got into the mid-20th century, we got larger scale pipes for mixtures, and so they sounded more fluty, which gave them more power in the upper range. So when you see the Roman numeral on the stop of plein jeu or mixture or scharf or cymbal, that tells you how many pipes are playing for each note that you press. So this plein jeu on the swell is a 6-ring mixture, quite a big mixture. So I can hear that is made up of all of those pitches. It's a 2-foot mixture. This stop tells me, actually, because it has a 2 on it. So if I were to pull an 8-foot principal on another manual, I don't have enough fingers to hold all of those down. But if I actually couple the swell to the pedal, all 6 of those pitches are in there. up of unisons and fifths. There are some mixtures that are going to be made up with thirds in there. Sometimes there might be a seventh if it's a harmonics mixture. This one here, there's a terz symbol on the positive division, so that is made up, if I can find it here. It's made up of, it has a third in there. The third is actually a little bit low in a terz symbol mixture. And so that's a mixture that I'm going to use for special effects. I'm not going to bring that on, you know, in my Bach prelude necessarily. Because it's such a high-pitched mixture, it has that third in it. It's a kind of special effect sound. Most of us don't have a terz symbol on our organ, so that's not an issue. But I think it's good to know when to use that, and that it's not necessarily just a pull-on every time I want mixtures kind of mixture.
So, the question I have about mixtures, there are actually physically 3 ranks of pipes.
That's right.
For the entire keyboard.
That's right. So 3 ranks for every note.
And those are separate from any of the other, usually.
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. Usually they are. The reason that I point this out is it's easy for us to pull over and, you know, to lean over and pull on a mixture stop without realizing that if you're playing a big chord of 8 notes and you've got on a 6-rank mixture, you've got 50 other pipes that you've just added in, playing at all of these upper ranges. And so you're bringing on a lot of very complicated overtone sound, which is good, you know, to have in there. But realizing that that you may look through and decide I can make this work with one mixture. You know, maybe the swell mixture is good, or maybe once I've built up and I'm to full on the swell division, and I'm playing a big piece. Maybe I only need the 2 great mixtures. Maybe I don't need this softer swell mixture and the softer positive mixture, because if you think about it and you pull on all the mixtures here and play, there starts to be this kind of, I mean, it's nearly impossible to have 150 high-pitched, tiny pipes that are all in tune at the same time. So you get this kind of sea of pipes that are not entirely in tune. So instead of pulling all of those, I might just decide I'm going to pull. I might just pull the great mixture or 2 great mixtures, as opposed to 3 different mixtures all at the same pitch, the swell mixture, the positive mixture, and the great mixture, because especially if they're in slightly different places, different levels of the instrument, there's a likelihood that they're not going to be in tune with one another. So find the one mixture, maybe the loudest one that you have on your great division, that's going to do the job for you if you're playing a big full section, and just take off the swell and the positive ones, because they might not be adding to the tone. They might actually be causing it to sound a little bit out of tune. There are times that if I'm building a chorus, I might pull 8, 4, 2 in the build-up, and then when pulling on the mixture, sometimes that mixture often will have the 2-foot pitch already in it, you know, as we were demonstrating before. A lot of mixtures start at 2-foot pitch. I have found sometimes that it works better for me to then take off the 2-foot stop, since that mixture already contains it. That's not always the case. Sometimes you need it in there, and the organ builder designed the instrument really needing that 2-foot pitch in there. But I found sometimes the tuning may be a little hairy, and then if I take off that 2-foot, I've got this nice, brilliant sound of the chorus that is in tune without those 2-foot ranks fighting. Remember, when we talk about a 2-foot rank, that's on the lowest note of the keyboard. So you get to baritone C, That's a 1 foot pipe. You get to middle C, that's a 1/4 of a foot, a 3-inch pipe. You get to the next one up, that's a 1.5-inch pipe. There's a very, very small margin for error in terms of tuning when you get pipes that are that high in pitch. And so that's why on a lot of instruments I may pile up a ton of 8-foot tone, because on an 8-foot pipe, you know, moving the tuning slide a hair's amount is not going to change the pitch drastically. On a 1.5-inch length resonator on a mixture, it's going to make quite a difference. So pile up the lower pitches that maybe use less, and maybe find that one mixture that's going to do the job for higher pitches. Let's see. There's if you take a mixture and you start playing all the way up from the bottom, you'll hear that it breaks back. If we start at 2-foot pitch, stop here on the positive so that I get those pitches. So it had been going all the way up with these unisons and fifths. And then when I get here, instead of the lowest note being the F sharp, it jumps down to the D. And then you hear it jump back down there. Now, why would organ builders do that? Why would they have it jump back down as you go up the compass? What's that? That's right. The pipes get too small, and it would get really, really squealy as you go up. And the whole reason for mixtures is to reinforce these higher harmonics, these upper partials in the chorus, to provide brilliance for us, which we want in the spectrum of organ sound. But if you never broke back, those pipes would just get higher and higher and higher as you went up the compass, and you'd have dogs barking all over the neighborhood. And so each different mixture on a well-designed organ is going to be composed differently in terms of the starting pitch and then where it breaks back, so that the idea being that you have these different opportunities with different kinds of mixtures, that not all mixtures are alike. You may have a swell mixture that hopefully is great for accompanying, in the sense that it's not too loud, it's not too big. It can slip in, work well with the reed chorus, but it provides just that right amount of sparkle and brilliance. Oftentimes, a positive mixture will be somewhat higher pitched. It might not break back as much, so that when you're playing wonderful Bach, it's got that brilliance and sparkle that you want. A great mixture, you may have one or two of those. On this organ, we have a forniture and a cymbal. The forniture starts at a lower pitch, breaks back, about an octave and a half up, and then another octave, and then breaks back again. The cymbal starts at 1 foot pitch, so. So it's starting to break back every 5 notes. There, it broke back again. So by the time you get up here, it actually has an 8-foot pitch in it. And the reason for that we don't need, all these pipes that are, have resonators, a half of a centimeter long, because it gets outside of our range of hearing and it's not going to contribute to the sound. So I know that it's not the most exciting thing in the world to go through and find out the composition of your mixtures, but sometimes it's quite interesting to see actually how high do those pipes go, and maybe take the mixture and couple it to the pedal and just go through the exercise of saying, okay, this is the swell mixture. Let's see, I'm going to pull on an 8-foot pitch on another manual pad. Figure out what pitches are playing. So that you get that sense of how those mixtures are made out, where they break back, and so forth. All right, moving on to doubling 8-foot stops. For some music where more richness of tone is desired, piling up 8-foot tone, principal flutes, and maybe strings without the celestes, unless you want that kind of effect, can be effective on especially thin-sounding instruments. Ones built in the mid-20th century, piling up 8-foot tone can help greatly. If you're wanting to play romantic music, the 19th century, that can be good. With Bach, you have to, of course, judge how thick do you want the sound to be. We don't necessarily want a big, thick sound in contrapuntal music. However, there are many instruments from that era where I'll pull on a fair amount of 8-foot tone because to my ear, in building a chorus that gives the base that you need, the B-A-S-E, the foundation for that tone. However, beware on instruments without enough wind that using flutes with principals can cause the wind to sag. Flutes, again, are the biggest scale, so they're the ones that eat the most wind, especially a big sub-bass in the pedal, especially big flute stops. So if you're playing and you hear that the organ starts, shaking because there's not enough wind, try taking off the flutes, especially in the pedal, any 8-foot flutes to give it a little bit more wind, or to not rob as much wind. This is my opinion. I tend to, beyond doubling up at the 8-foot pitch in the manuals and 16 and 8-foot pitches in the pedal, I tend not to double up on 4-foot stops and definitely not 2-foot stops in the manuals. The reason being the same thing we talked about in terms of finding which mixture is going to be most effective on your instrument and then using that one when you're combining lots of sound. Because if I were to build, say, a principal chorus and I'm going to combine 8-foot and 4-foot from all these divisions, if I then start adding a lot of 4-foot flutes, for example, there's a little bit of tuning. There's actually a little bit of out of tune. Just you can hear that when I add those in, it starts to waver a bit, especially if I start adding in 2-foot flutes into that sound. If I'm pulling on 2-foot principals as well, then we have this kind of shimmer, not sounding in tune. Whereas if I just say, I'm going to only use 8 and 4 principals and then maybe 1 2-foot principal, it's really cleanly locked in tune. So there again, I would say, don't put together 2-foot flutes and 2-foot principals. Just use the 2-foot principal if you're going for a principal chorus kind of sound. You'll get a stronger sound by having it all be in tune. In terms of coupling, listen to discern if they're in tune with one another. What we just discovered here is today, at this time in the morning, the swell is a little bit hairy, a little bit apart apart from where the positive and the great are. So a lot of times as I'm building up a chorus, I'll listen for, okay, is that division right locked in with all the other divisions? I've played instruments where at one time of the year, the choir division may just be a little bit flat because the heating ducts are on the other side of the room and they keep the swell and the grate at a pretty constant temperature, but that positive division or that choir division is on the outside north wall of the church in Maine, and it's just never going to be quite as in tune as the rest. And so while I might still use that choir division on its own, I won't couple to it or couple it to other manuals. So listen to your instrument because that likely is going to change throughout the year depending on if it's really hot, if it's moderate, if it's cold. Yes?
I hate to interrupt and ask this,
No, please do.
we have I play the organ and then we have a pianist and we play together all the time. And sometimes in the winter, the organ is so off. And I mean, it's like the whole thing is off.
Within itself. I mean,
Right,
and also off from the tuning with
Right,
it. Yeah.
well, especially compared to the piano,
Yeah.
where we just almost
Can't play
together.
Yeah.
Is there anything that can be?
You can
As
pay a
the
lot of
name
money
does.
to your
Yeah.
organ technician to, I mean, I think one would be to see if maybe the room could be kept a degree or two warmer, you know, at those times that you're going to be playing together. It wouldn't have to be all during the week, but to have it just at that time. I think the other would be, and we have done this before when we've had big events where both are going to be played together, is to have the piano repitched, you know, in the dead of winter, to have its pitch lower just a little bit so that it goes with the organ. That's going to be a lot less expensive than retuning the whole organ top to bottom. What were you going to add?
I've had that problem in the church before, and we finally had to turn the heat on an extra hour and a half early.
Yeah.
Every Sunday morning.
Yeah.
To make it work.
Well,
It
and
was-
I think
it was
that's
like way off.
I think that's the other thing.
And we just finally, that's what we had to do.
Well, and we've had, I mean, our air conditioning or heat come on in the sanctuary at like 3 in the morning on, you know, Saturday night, Sunday morning, or before any events in there, so that there's plenty of time for the room to reach temperature, and then another 3 or 4 hours for the organ pipes to all settle in at that same temperature. So you might try that first, just requesting, can we turn the heat on Saturday night, or the air, or whichever it is. And then the other would be to once the heat is fully on, say in the winter, and the organ pitch is going to be lower because colder air is heavier. So inside those resonators, it's going to cause the pitch to come down slightly, to have the piano tuned to that, kind of a winter tuning, and see if that might work. Another thing, and this is a good time to mention this. Flue pipes and reed pipes react to temperature changes differently. And why would that be? Does anyone have an idea why that would be?
Well, because the flues take more wind, and it's the wind, the air temperature that makes it out of tune, and the reeds take less.
Yeah. And that's true. And then the other aspect of it is the way that tone is made. With both types of pipes, the resonator is important because it gives it the quality tone. With flue pipes, it's even more important because it's actually the air that's inside all of that resonator, from the mouth of the pipe all the way up to the top. It's that air that is vibrating that's creating that pitch. So if it's an 85-degree room, that air is going to vibrate at a different rate than if it's a 65-degree room. 85-degree room, that pitch is going to be higher because the air vibrates faster. 65-degree room, it's going to vibrate more slowly, so the pitch is going to be flat. Why do I bring this up? Which of your churches has ever had the heat or the AC go out so that on a Sunday morning it's either too hot or too cold? So that doesn't just happen at Highland Park United Methodist. That has happened before. We had a time, it was right, I can't remember if it was before Christmas or after Christmas. Christmas this year. But we were doing the first movement of the Rudder Gloria. And it was going to be organ-only accompaniment, no brass. And I came in, the heat was not working. It was like about 58 degrees in the room. And of course, you know, people are coming in there and the lights are going to be on, so it'll be okay for the people to worship. The organ was not happy. The flutes were very flat from the reeds. The reeds tend to stay pretty much where they are. I mean, yes, you've got a reed here or there that flies off in terms of tuning, but reeds will stay pretty much where they are throughout the year. The flues are what fluctuate based on the temperature. So what I did is I went through all my registrations for that, and I never used flues and reeds together. You know, for the very opening of that, which is it's a brass group playing, I took all of the flues off, except for in the pedal. I had some pedal flues in there. But no flues on the manuals. It was just 8 and 4 foot reeds, you know, on the swell and on the break, and that was in tune. It sounded fabulously in tune. And then when we got to the softer sections, I'd take all the reeds off and I'd bring on flutes, and that sounded in tune with itself. If I ever used a reed and a flute together, it sounded horrible. So there are ways to kind of work around this. I also had an experience that was a bit harrowing. I was playing for the Hartford AGO Regional Convention at St. Joseph's Catholic Cathedral in Hartford. Beautiful, huge, enormous space. Big 130 rank Austin organ in the back balcony. The organist and director of music there, Ezekiel Menendez, had told the convention planners, the only time we can use the organ in here and it be really well in tune is at a 10 a.m. recital or an 8 p.m. recital, either before the sun is shining on that window or in the evening. They planned, I think it was a 1 or 2 p.m. recital, of course. And so in the 2 days prior, while I'm preparing, I thought, okay, let's see, it's 1 o'clock, so this is probably how the organ is going to sound. So in that space, I think there's solo, swell, the grate is all in the middle with the sun shining on it. I think choir might have been over here with the swell. So what I noticed as I was registering is that the enclosed divisions were in tune with themselves, but it sounded horrible if I coupled swell to grate, because the grate was heating up in the sunlight. And so I thought, okay, well then as I register things, I'm going to avoid coupling division, you know, swell to grate or solo to grate, but it had a big, huge solo division with a nice big chorus, so I could actually make a really nice big sound, solo and swell together. So I thought, okay, that'll be my mode of operation. So I went through and did that, and then the next day I came in, and this was the morning of the recital, and it just sounded horrible. Things were not in tune with one another. This was not good. So then I realized, okay, grate and swell are in tune with one another, but I can't put the solo with that. And so I kind of rejiggered everything. And bottom line is I was reworking it right up until the recital started, and I was thinking, I just hope that, you know, everything works out right. And it did, and it worked well. But, you know, you can take the attitude of, well, it doesn't, if the organ's out of tune, it's not my fault. And that's true, but you could also say, well, I'm going to do what I can to make this sound as good as it can. So in every instrument, no matter how well controlled the space is, there are going to be certain things that float differently at different times of the year. So it's good to kind of know when that happens and what things you might need to do to compensate for that. Let's see, moving on very fast-moving passages in Liszt and in Bach. What I have found sometimes, especially if you have a nice big great division and you're not relying heavily on the other divisions to give you enough sound, it can be good to uncouple the great so that you have all of the sound coming from one area. We talked about this a little bit when Andy played the jig fugue yesterday, that having all of the sound coming from the Great Division, 8-4-2, mixture, maybe a reed in there, that is going to be better than 8-4-2 mixture, and then 8-4-2 mixture reed on the swell, 8-4-2 mixture on the positive reed. You've got then sound coming from multiple places. You can have it all coming from the same place. It'll give more clarity and you'll be able to articulate better. Sometimes if you're playing along and it just sounds mushy, but you don't want to uncouple things because maybe you're playing some fancy list something or some exciting passage in B-dur, try just closing down the boxes so that then you've really got uncoupled grade because those enclosed divisions are soft. And then it actually clears up the sound quite a lot. Super couplers are often most useful when you're combining masses of strings and celeste. By super couplers, I mean a 4-foot like swell to grade 4, positive to grade 4. When adding power or brilliance when you're playing low in the range of the manuals, adding power or brilliance on small, medium-sized, early 20th century organs without much upper work or brilliance. Dr. Jones was telling me about a children's concert she played in Colorado Springs. It was supposed to be a children's concert, and then as people started coming in, the youngest person there was 43 years old. She realized this is not going to be a children's concert, so I need to rework my program. And she said the organ had 8, 8, 8, 8, and then on the swell, 8, 8, 8, 4 foot. And so, you know, some people might look at that and say, oh, well, I can't play Bach here. I can't play French music, and, you know, I could only play little period pieces like Reverie or something. But if you use super couplers, you can get that kind of brilliance to play, you know, Dupre B major and the other things she said that she played on that recital. So that's where super couplers are very much needed and how they were intended to be used on those instruments. And it can be helpful when adding power and definition during a big solo pedal line. I tend not to use a lot of 4-foot couplers to the pedal until I really need it for that extra strength and power in it. If you use them just all the time, then you're tangling with what your left hand is doing on the manuals. You're kind of stealing some of its thunder by adding those. So it's helpful when it gets to a big place where the solo needs to come through in the pedal. Sub-couplers are often most useful, 16-foot couplers this is, when playing high in the range of the manuals. When you get to the end of a big finale in French music, it was pretty much expected. You're going to pull on the octave grave, the swell to grade 16, positive to grade 16, the grade to grade 16, so that you get that big climactic sound, because usually people have you playing up here, so there's the expectation that you're going to, the 16-foot stops on, 16-foot couplers to add the gravity in the middle range. And here's a place, I don't know how many of you play in Messiaen. But there are times in music that, you know, composers will write things, the opening of the Messiaen, both hands are playing the exact same notes, and then there's a section at the end where there is the opportunity to actually cheat on that. Because both hands are playing exactly the same thing, you could use your subcouplers, but only play the right hand, and then you can divide it between the two. So I can still get that nice big, without being so terrified of trying to get those notes right. And then, you know, when you get to the end, you can play, you know. But that, you know, look for places where if you've got a really challenging passage and both hands are playing the same thing, you might be able to kind of make your life easier by using a subcoupler in that way. It's still good to learn how to play it the right way because not all organs have subcouplers or supercouplers. We talked a little, there's a lot of information here about flute constructions. You have stop flutes like a Borden, a Gedect, a Koppel flute, which have a particular kind of beautifully hollow sound. Those pipes are actually half the length of what the number on the pipe would say. So when it says Gedect 8 foot, yes, the speaking length of that is 8 foot. It's 8 foot pitch, but that pipe is actually only 4 feet long. Why? Because when you put a stopper in it, it effectively doubles the speaking length of that pipe. And what that also does in terms of the harmonic makeup is it takes out the odd-numbered overtones. So in stopped pipes like Gedects, you're going to have very prominent 8 foot, skip the 4 foot, 2 2/3, skip the 2 foot, and 1 3/5 overtones. So you'll hear in stopped pipes like a roar flute, a roar Gedect, a Gedect, a Borden, you'll hear but you won't hear a lot of Now, by contrast, with an open flute like a harmonic flute, you hear that sound is it has this wonderfully realistic kind of fuzziness. Especially when you get up here in this range. My wife is a flutist in the Dallas Symphony, and I always say, oh, I heard the most wonderful harmonic flute the other day. It sounds just like you. She just rolls her eyes. And what I mean is that's the wonderful thing about an orchestral flute, and I'm talking about the one that plays in the orchestra, is that it has all of these overtones, 8, 4, 2 2/3, 2, 1 3/5. All of those are present. And that's what makes that beautiful, realistic, alive sound. That's why we have harmonic flutes, is because they have that all of those harmonics are very richly present. And in the good one, it ascends and just gets stronger and stronger as you get towards the top of the range. As opposed to a roar flute, which is more hollow sounding. It's beautiful as well in its own right, but it has a different makeup. It doesn't have all of those harmonics in there. And let me touch on this, and then we'll skip to 2 other things, and then I'll play something for you. There's an optimal range for each family of tone. Flutes tend to be strongest in the highest range of sound. If you listen to this roar flute, not only is it not very clear in terms of pitches, but it's also not really strong. But as I get higher, it actually gets stronger and gets louder. Strings tend to be really strong in their low range. And it's audible, but it's thin up here, down here, and brings some power and clarity and gravity. Reeds tend to be the strongest in the middle range. Up here, not quite as much. That's a nice French reed. It does have strength down there in the low range, but that's one of the wonderful ways that the organ has these different types of sound that are each strong in different areas. So when I'm choosing a solo stop and I have something that's up here in the treble range, I tend to gravitate not towards a clarinet, because a clarinet is going to sound nicest in its tenor range. I'm going to tend to gravitate towards a harmonic flute or something like that. If I have a solo that's really low in the range, I might actually like to play strings. Because they have that edge and that strength that a narrow scale is going to give. The thing that's wonderful about principles is that good ones are designed to be strong in all of the ranges. On the next page, I give a plethora of different ways that you can combine different mutations, flute combinations, and a few ideas about how, when you're choosing pedal registrations, if you're playing something contrapuntal like Bach, how you could make the best choices in terms of what's going to speak well. And then I spoke a little bit, if you look to the next page, about how to set up divisional pistons. I spoke a little bit about that yesterday in the class about accompanying, to give you an idea of how I tend to set up those so that I can have them in a crescendo. There's a lot more information here, but I want to play for you just a little bit because someone requested that I would play the Fox, Come Sweet Death. And it is an exercise in traversing all different types of sound and all different dynamic ranges, because it goes from the softest whisper up to the loudest roar and then back down again. And so I'll do that here. It's going to cause us to be just a little bit late going into our break, so if you need to take a break or anything, you're welcome to get up and do that. But many of you know this piece. It's, in two verses. It's Fox's kind of reworking for organ of what Leopold Stokowski did in his big orchestration of this Bach chorale. Come sweetest death, come blessed rest, take my hand and gently lead me on. Fox worked it for the Wanamaker department store organ, which has a string division in it larger than this organ totally. But it works really well on the right kind of instrument. So 2 verses. The first one doesn't get very loud. The second one builds all the way to full organ and then drifts away into nothing at the end. And that's the challenge, is how to do that. So let's hear it.